Yeah, hello everyone. Good evening. I am Devatyo, and on behalf of Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy, I extend a very warm welcome to all of you for this third episode of the Green Mandate. Today is also Earth Day, and it could not have been any better occasion to talk about plastic, which is the most common and shared environmental challenge across the whole Earth. Plastic, which refers to products obtained from like various components like polypropylene, polyethylene, polyvinyl chloride, polystyrene. There are many like poly. So have now become an almost inseparable part of our lifestyle. And it's like inertness, thermostability, durability, and resistance to degradation and liquid, make them quite valuable product actually. So especially for healthcare or packaging, transport of essential goods, or food materials, insulation, electronics, even clothing. Now we have and almost everything. I think plastic has used in almost like anything you name and it is there. It plays a very significant role in improving human life and comfort. But then again, we human beings have no control over our ever increasing urge to use what is a necessity to like become it from a more like a luxury. So, and this resistance of the plastic to degrade and the durability for which it's known also makes it persist in our environment for like very long time, not decades, but centuries. Like, and with no decomposition, it only breaks into smaller and smaller pieces, which we now call microplastics. So today, Earth is full of plastics and microplastics. They are present in soil, in air, in water bodies, in the oceans. They are even found in our bloodstream now, in our lungs, placenta, food we consume. Like they all have microplastics everywhere. So, an article in the UN website I was going through just before this talk, and it was saying that plastics are ubiquitous, are becoming part of Earth's fossil record and a marker of the Anthropocene. So, this is what is the plastic. So, after maybe like millennia down the lane, people will go through the fossil record, they will find plastics. So, and according to one estimate, we generate around 400 million tons of plastic waste every year, and most of it is a single-use origin, and they end up polluting all this like ocean or water. And there is also interestingly a new habitat type now referred as plastic sphere, to depict the marine microorganisms which thrive on such microplastic debris in the ocean. And it is not about only the waste, but also the process of producing plastic is also very fossil intensive. And it is expected that by next 20 years, this plastic production will actually contribute to nearly one-fifth of the global carbon emissions. So you can understand that from beginning from this production to the waste, it has huge environmental footprint. There is a global consciousness about rising plastic waste on Earth and the need to limit waste use, at least where we can, and where alternative exists. So, and when we think of any big behavioral reforms, I think bringing in a policy and making law is the first step. And in India, we had introduced this plastic waste management and handling rules 11 years ago in 2011, which was superseded by plastic waste rules in 2016. The rules have been amended a few more times after every 2-3 years. Like for instance, there was a phase out of multi-layer plastic in 2018 amendment. Last year there was an amendment with phase so that there will be ban on single-use plastic from July this year. Even this last month in February, this recent amendment, which we will discuss more with Satyarupa, first time they legally mandated the extended producer's responsibility on the manufacturer, importers, and the brand owners, especially this online marketplaces. So, all these rules appear to be notified with a very noble intention and are expected to bring down our plastic footprint. But we know from our experience in other environmental laws, it is not what is the mandate. But the real test of any law is how they're implemented on ground and whether the regulatory framework, the executive action, the public awareness, and the political will is sufficient enough to make the law successful. Okay, so all factors play a very important role. And then there is also judiciary, which again, and the civil society who keeps the watch and monitoring this thing. So today we will discuss this very important aspect of regulating plastic waste in India, especially this EPR. I will use the short form EPR for extended producer's responsibility. And we are very fortunate to have with us Ms. Satyarupa Shekhar, who is the East Pacific coordinator of the global movement Break Free from Plastic. She has a very long experience in an engagement with policy research and advocacy groups on issues that are often, even very neglected by the governments and the public. She has also worked with the government of Tamil Nadu to improve their data management practices, to plan civic infrastructure better, institution of zero waste systems, and enforce single-use plastic ban. So I think she's I think the best expert to talk about these issues, especially like how these laws translate in the ground. And Satyarupa, on behalf of Vidhi and everyone present today, I extend a warm welcome to you. Thank you for agreeing to share your knowledge and experience with us today. Let me also introduce Vidhi. So Vidhi is an independent think tank doing legal research to make better laws and improve governance for the public good. We do this through high quality original research, engaging with the governments and other public institutions to both inform policymaking and to effectively convert policy into law. And we are primarily based out of Delhi and Bengaluru with a new office in Mumbai, which started a couple of years ago. The climate and ecosystem team, which I lead at Vidhi, is works primarily on various environmental laws, especially understanding the implementation challenges on the ground, sharing critiques on the new amendments to environmental laws, identifying neglected aspects of the regulatory framework, and shaping public narratives through partnerships, communication initiative. We organize public discussions, roundtable meetings, and we have also produced documentary movies last to last year on this implementation of community. So all our research are independent and freely accessible from our website. With this, I wish to hand over the dais to Satyarupa. And Satyarupa, you may start by introducing us to the history and background of regulation of the plastics in India, and then we can discuss some questions which I have got, to get the conversation going. And attendees can type in questions in the comment box in the Q&A session, and if time permits, we also take few questions from the audience, if any. So over to you, Satyarupa.
Thanks so much, Devaditya, to you and to Vidhi, actually, for such a warm welcome and even providing this platform and this opportunity for us to share a little bit about what Break Free from Plastic has been doing. I will share my presentation. Is it visible? Yeah?
Yes, yes, it is visible.
Okay. So basically, I play the role of the regional coordinator for the Asia Pacific region for the Break Free from Plastic movement. Very quickly, it's really, in summary, a global movement to stop plastic pollution. And we look at the entire life cycle of plastic, right from extraction all the way to post-consumer waste management and disposal. And various aspects of this include policy, narrative shift, corporate accountability, and also promoting solutions like zero waste solutions and countering false solutions. In India, we have about 35 core members, all working on different aspects of plastic pollution. And for this presentation, I actually draw on much of the work that many of them have been doing. So really just to give you a very, very quick background into where do we stand with, when we talk about plastic pollution, I think it's very important to actually even understand how much are we really producing. And what we are actually seeing by way of pollution is a very, very small fraction. It's minuscule in comparison to actually what estimates there are in terms of how much plastic has already been produced and continues to be produced and is actually projected to be produced. And this is why it's very important for BFFP to take a very, very systemic approach to how do we address pollution caused by plastic. So as I was mentioning, we are looking at global policy. There is two aspects to the global policy. One is around the Basel Convention rules. Very recently, we had a major victory for the movement where at the UN Environment Assembly in Nairobi in March, all member states have actually agreed to creating a legally binding global treaty to address plastic pollution. And this is very, very significant because it actually impacts across its life cycle. And this context is actually very, very particularly important for India because this is actually where we stand. So one of our member organizations has actually been looking at some of the policies with respect to the petrochemical expansion that we're seeing in India. And what we're seeing is a massive expansion of the capacities across the country, not just in the petrochemical production itself, but also in plastic parks where a lot of this petrochemicals will become feedstock for the plastic that we are going to see and have to deal with. So in this particular context, it's very, very relevant for us to actually look at the policy framework within which we're talking about EPR framework. This is basically a very, very quick summary of where does EPR actually draw its relevance from? Of course, it's the Constitution of India, the EPA, but more specifically the SWM and the PWM rules. And very recently, we are actually seeing the Plastic Waste Management Amendment Rules of 2022, which have particular significance for our conversation today. This is really just to give a quick legislative timeline. Many of the participants here actually probably know these rules and have studied all of these clauses more than I have. So I don't want to go into the details of the rules. What I do want to say is that we've actually been seeing very frequent amendments to the plastic waste management rules. And a little bit further down in the presentation, I want to show or demonstrate a little bit around how many of these amendments actually have proven to be very distracting and in fact have derailed India's efforts from actually managing our plastic waste. So very specifically, since this conversation is really about EPR, it's important to actually understand that extended producer responsibility is more of a policy principle, even though it is actually now globally being seen as a specific tool, right, to address various kinds of environmental impact. And this actually is very important to actually distinguish a specific instrument from the principle behind which many of our policies should actually draw from. EPR, very specifically, as it is defined by Thomas Lindquist, who first framed this policy principle back in 1990, stresses on how it is very important to look at how EPR can actually promote product systems across the entire life cycle of the product. So it's not, at this point, it's very important for us to actually understand that the principle is actually quite wholesome, as opposed to what we are seeing in the India policies, where it's a very specific tool or an instrument that is designed to actually manage post-consumer waste. Even though we do have some words about pre-consumer waste, largely a lot of our policies, whether it's Swachh Bharat Mission or any of the other policies that include waste management, whether it's in smart cities, whether it's in housing policies, all of them focus on preventing litter, plastic litter, as opposed to actually reducing plastic and eventually eliminating plastic. The current situation in India, we are actually seeing that what a lot of activists are actually trying to chase down is really trying to understand what is the magnitude of the problem. And I've only put two sort of data sources here. One is a CPCB claiming a certain number. There's an industry estimate. And of course, there are other estimates that we are seeing from civil society. We have Center for Science and Environment, we have TERI, WRI, many of people are actually putting out statistics. But unless all of these statistics actually inform our policy and inform what EPR should look like, what will eventually just happen is that little image on the right, which is, the quality of our inputs is going to decide what the quality of the outputs basically are. And so I really want to focus a little bit around, aside from what the policy says, a little bit around what have companies been doing behind the scenes, even as the country has been talking about framing very important policies. And we have had our Prime Minister actually talk in very important fora globally about the need to address plastic pollution. In some sense, in 2018, when he announced that India should have a plastic ban, and then also at various global fora saying that legally we should have a globally binding treaty. In some sense, it set the framework or it set the tone for what we expected to happen this year at the UNEA. However, we actually see a big gap between what is said abroad and what's going on in the country. And in the country, actually, we're seeing a lot of tactics that can delay, distract, and derail. And what I mean by these are basically very specific clauses that are actually being amended and in fact even deleted. So one very important clause that I want to talk about is the use of multi-layered plastics or sachets, as we very commonly call them. In 2011 and in 2016, the rules basically said that these had to be phased out. This was a very clear recognition of the fact that sachets or multi-layered plastics cannot actually be recycled or reused in any way. With the 2018 amendment, what we've seen is that now, rather than calling it non-recyclable, we are actually saying that it can be non-energy recoverable. And this is very important because at the same time as these policies are being discussed, we are actually having other industries related to the plastic industry that's also that are also in the mix. So when we say non-energy recoverable, what's happening is that a lot of plastic industry players are actually collecting or encouraging other actors to collect and send plastic waste to cement kilns, which have now been classified as energy recovery. So these important amendments in these simple words, from recycled to recyclable or recovered to recoverable, are very, very important when we are actually talking about finally, do we achieve the outcomes that we actually want? Of course, we've had several delaying tactics. What we've actually seen is more than 30 states and union territories have some form of legislation, actually, whether it's partial or complete, banning plastics, single-use plastics. However, what we did observe as recently as 2018 is that Maharashtra government, which had among the most strongest and most progressive legislations in the country, actually suspended the ban, right? Now, and this was very clearly linked to certain FMCGs actually lobbying with the government right before the ban came into force. We've seen, of course, lax implementation, but this particular influence of the industry in actually delaying and even subverting many of our legislations is very important for us to recognize, even as we're talking about extended producer responsibility. The other thing that we are seeing increasingly happen is many of these FMCGs actually announcing projects and programs that purportedly minimize plastic pollution. But eventually what we're seeing is many of these are paying waste picker groups or producer responsibility organizations to actually collect plastic waste and transport these to cement kilns or incinerators. That is not actually reducing plastic, nor is it reducing pollution. Cement kilns are basically the most toxic. Cement in itself is the most toxic industry, but cement kilns, of course, do not function as, in a sense of incineration, where there are some form of filters in terms of the emissions that result, whether they're gaseous or into our water or in our soil. So a lot of these are just distracting. A lot of these are PR campaigns that also co-opt civil society. What we are seeing Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Unilever, and Nestle do is launch very, very big projects with very important civil society organizations across the country. We are seeing Pepsi, Unilever fund gasolyzers or pyrolysis plants, which are in effect incineration. In extremely fragile ecosystems in the country. In the Himalayas, we're actually seeing a lot of these pyrolysis plants or incinerators come up. to deal with plastic waste. And this, of course, is not limited to India alone. We are actually seeing many of these Indian players join global alliances. The Alliance to End Plastic Waste is one of these major players, but there are many others where Indian players are actually joining. And what this does is actually subverts this principle of extended producer responsibility and distracts us from actually addressing plastic pollution. So I think that what we really need to do is understand who is asking the questions that then result in the kinds of policies that we are seeing. What kind of assumptions are we making when we ask these questions, and what kind of information is then being used to make these policies is something that we, as whether it's lawyers, researchers, civil society activists, it's very important for us to actually consider what's driving some of these policies and the way they're framed. And of course, when we are doing some kinds of analysis, whether it's life cycle analysis assessments or comparing single-use plastic, we had a committee that was created last year to actually determine what should be that list of single-use plastic that will be banned. So the list of plastic items that will be banned, that comes out in June, there was a committee to actually look at its impact and its impact on the environment versus its utility. Now, if one looks at the reasoning that the committee came up with and the actual items that made their way onto that list, you actually do not see a clear correspondence. So there are things with low utility and high environmental impact that are still on that ban list. Yet there are things that have high utility, which are not exempt from the ban. So what is the point of having these committees, and what kind of questions are these committees asking, which are then framing some of these policies? And basically, I would say that there is a lot of obfuscation. Much of it is quite deliberate. When we ask you these questions, what kinds of assumptions we are making, when we say that EPR can include energy recovery, I think we're ignoring a lot of the science that already exists. We do not need to do new scientific studies. I think there's a lot of established evidence on chemical recycling, for instance, being extremely bad, not feasible technically, and financially extremely unviable. But also, I think things that are classified within EPR or Plastic Waste Management Rules 2022, plastic to oil, for instance, or plastic in roads. These are all false solutions, and it ignores really the science behind how does a polymer react when it is chemically treated. Heating up oil obviously creates a certain, goes through a certain process. And I think it's important for us to recognize that even if we are able to recover a little bit of fuel, the process of the recovery is extremely toxic, highly carbon intensive, highly energy intensive. And eventually, we really must ask, has it been really worth it for using plastic for a few seconds? A lot of our businesses globally are part of something called the Global Commitment by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And this is what the EMF itself says, that there has been actually very, very limited progress on the commitments companies have made themselves. And in that context, we really should question whether India's effort to frame the EPR is sufficient in actually turning this around, right? So just very quickly to refer to a small study that we did last year, we actually looked at the top 7 polluting FMCGs. These are the companies that we looked at and some of the alliances. And what we found was that a lot of their investment is actually going into projects to continue business as usual. Even as they're making global commitments, even as they're making commitments to EPR, whether they're voluntary or mandatory, we are actually seeing that much of their attention is actually going to continue business as usual. Very, very little investment or energy or effort is actually made to create real solutions to the plastic pollution problem. And those solutions exist. In India, we have a lot of excellent reuse solutions. Across the world, we actually have them. And we actually see companies do not encourage those reuse solutions. So this is, I mean, I'll leave the slide deck with participants, and this report is also available on the Break Free from Plastic site. But basically, this is what we see companies investing in. A whopping 85% of projects are actually found to be investing in false solutions. Solutions or technology that have already been proven to not work. And something that I referred to earlier, the cement kilns industry, what we are seeing is a very obvious connection between FMCGs or businesses or producers of plastic with cement kilns. So even as EPR mandates collection, and unfortunately, much of our EPR currently focuses on post-consumer waste disposal, what's happening is companies are actually tying up with cement kilns to actually divert plastic waste from, the public view, I would say. It doesn't go away. We are literally just moving our toxicity from one form to another, from one location to another. And if you really need to address plastic pollution, we obviously need to strengthen our EPR laws better. And of course, Devaditya, I think this was something you were mentioning early on. The bioaccumulation of the toxins in plastic. Again, there's a lot of scientific evidence already present. We are seeing this, of course, like you said, in breast milk, in placenta, but we are increasingly seeing how plants are directly absorbing a lot of these plastic additives. Almost all kinds of plastic have hundreds, if not 1,000 kinds of additives. When we're talking about plastic being this miraculous material that can take any shape, color, form, the kinds of additives, the chemical additives that go into making that plastic stable, whether it's to allow that to hold a certain shape, to not be too smelly, to be flame retardant, all of those things require chemicals, and the effects of those chemicals have already been proven, and proven to have actually neurological impacts. Many of these, if absorbed by women in a fertile age, gets absorbed in even their eggs. If those eggs are fertilized into female children, those female children are already seen to be pre-exposed and are likely to conceive babies that are again pre-exposed. So we are talking about scientific studies today showing that anybody exposed to plastic today or the toxins today actually is exposing almost 3 generations down the line, right? And this is the kind of intergenerational impacts that are already occurring. Unfortunately, our policies, EPR policies, do not actually take into account many of these, either scientific evidence or the principles, for instance, of intergenerational equality, or even, thinking about just transitions. I will start my presentation with this last quote. What we are seeing is that even though elimination of plastic is very, very possible, and it offers us the biggest opportunity to address our climate change problems. What we are seeing actually in reality, and the rest of the report actually talks about this, is that corporations or businesses actually are doing very little to use those solutions that already exist. We're actually seeing a lot more effort globally as well as in our own countries to actually subvert very progressive policies and also to co-opt civil society efforts into ensuring that business remains business as usual. As a way forward, obviously, we need to think about the toxicity in plastics, but also, when we're talking about recyclability and recycling, to not forget that reducing virgin plastic is also a very, very important part of reducing plastic pollution downstream. And of course, I think there's a lot of, research, a lot of activism, even in our own country, to highlight institutionally how it is important that more ministries talk to each other. Ministries don't work counter to each other, as we are seeing MOEF and the Ministry for Chemicals and Fertilizer do, for instance, when we just talk about plastic pollution. And of course, I think the federal structure in the country, of course, lends its own challenges, but none of them are insurmountable. And I think if we want to really address plastic pollution, EPR is a great tool. However, I think it would be important to actually recognize a lot of the science, but also I think the realities that exist in our country today.
Thank you, Satyarupa. I think this is really a very eye-opener thing, especially the examples you have given about how the industrial lobby has tried to influence this like delay. It's very it's not surprising, and also you have talked about like how the shift is like changing the like public narrative from the consumerism to this addressing only the waste. We are saying that you can consume plastic, but we are there to take care of the waste. This is what the narrative is going on. So the entire focus is on the end of life or recycling things. There's hardly anything on how to reduce the consumption of plastic at all. And you spoke about this things about additives. So as plastic is not just plastic, there are many chemicals which are used to for this in various purpose, and you can transform generation to generation. So one in the food cycle, one also from generation to generation. And also this tinkering with terms and definitions to dilute the effectiveness of the law. So this is something that very useful information. Thank you for sharing all these things. So now I will ask you certain questions, and you have already spoke about the EPR, how uh, the mandate is should have been broad. But given that, whatever we take them from give them benefit of doubt, okay, fine. The intention is fine. You are doing estimate to this responsibility, and it is first time through this customers which have given the environment, they have given a target. Before that, it was I think municipalities were supposed to reach out to the manufacturers for assistance in extent personal responsibility. Now there's a clear guideline, EPR, and there is a minimum target for recycling and disposable of plastic waste by the manufacturers, and the deadline of 2028. Now we have seen in the some other notifications, for example, in this coal-based power plant and many other deadlines were given, and they have been extended things like 5 years, then 6 years, 7 years, but nothing is happening on the ground. So this is, I think, across all the environment law, this issue is there. But in this notification, what interested me a lot is that they have kept a provision of environmental compensation to be levied on the non-compliant entities. But at the same time, they have also said that if some manufacturer or importer has overutilized the target, they can share the they can issue a certificate and they can charge the money from other companies and they can buy the certificate. And if they do that, then they won't be penalized. So first of all, you've already discussed this, and this disposal and incineration is not a solution. But overall, given this, they had also talked about recycling and all these things. So how realistic and practical do you think these targets are? And do you think the manner in which the EPR has been prescribed by the government is the ideal one? And do they follow the global best practices? Like I'm sure this is the policy principle. So it may have passed into some law in some country which have worked or may not work. So whether when we issued this notification, whether we have taken those learnings and from this information roadblocks and any other things. So if you can just share your opinion on that.
So a lot of questions in one question, Devaditya. So I'm going to try and answer as many as I can. In terms of the targets, yes, for the first time, we're actually seeing in the country that there are a few targets. And they seem fairly ambitious, given that we didn't have any targets before. However, I think it's important to even recognize that given the magnitude of the problem, I think we're doing too little and too late. So I would say that the targets could have been more ambitious, but I guess we should be thankful that there are some targets to begin with. I think the problem with some of the targets are that the collection targets, for instance, which start at 25%, start in 21, 22, but the mandates for recycling actually come into play in 2024, right? So anything that exceeds the mandate for collection between 21 and 24, what happens to that plastic, right? Where does it go? And basically what we're seeing is that the EPR rules or the guidelines basically provide a menu of options. You can do this, or you can do this, or you can do that, you know. And of course, people are choosing the path of least resistance. And many of them are basically sending it for quote unquote energy recovery, which is basically the option. But in effect, it's cement kilns or incinerators which are receiving all of this plastic. So I think this is the first gap that we see in some of the targets, is that the focus really has been on collection, and actually what happens to that plastic, that target or that mandate comes into play a little bit later. In the meantime, I think also it has been very difficult to even think about what would be the intent of a lot of the companies when you're provided a menu of options. It is easier, of course, to choose to send it for incineration. And I think we'll only have to wait to see how many companies are actually changing their processes to eliminate or reduce plastic production in the first place, of use of plastic, versus focusing constantly on the collection and the handling of the waste. So that's, I think, the second aspect. The third, I think, is to recognize that even when recycling mandates are there, in reality, of course, one is the problem of what is called recycling, but also recycling capacity. In reality, the recycling capacity that currently exists cannot cater to the amount of plastic waste that is actually being generated in the country. And most of the recycling is happening in the informal sector. Very few guidelines exist, if at all any. I think the last, if I'm not mistaken, the last standard for recycling was set in 1998 and has not been revised or upgraded or updated since. However, the fact that a lot of the recycling happens in the informal sector, which is not regulated, means that not much of this is going to be happening, keeping any safety norms in place. I think there's very little incentive for the informal sector to become formalized without several negative financial implications on those units. I think the one important thing when it comes to the target around recycling is about incorporating recycled plastics into packaging again. Keeping aside the food applications, I think incorporating recycled plastic into packaging, I think, starts only in 2025. So I think there is that 4 to 5 year gap or window where we aren't really sure if companies are actually going to set up the right processes to incorporate this plastic, recycled plastic, into their production streams. And I think the worrying part about using recycled plastic in food applications is that at this point, obviously, the FSSAI has been prudent, as it should be. Plastic is increasingly unstable the more recycling it goes through. So every stage of recycling means less stability. In any case, even virgin plastic leaches a lot of chemicals. So FSSAI would want to, or should actually set in place a lot of protection. But at this point, when we talk about food applications, FSSAI has only set in place a notification for PET, a recycled PET to be used for food application. So what happens to all of the other plastic, about 43% of which is not PET, right? I think 43 is a conservative estimate, but basically what happens to all of that other plastic before the mandate for this target comes into play? So I think these are some of my top concerns. Even as we recognize the first time that we had targets, it's good. However, I think there are lots of gaps that we still need to address. I think one of the other questions was around implementation or examples in other countries that we can draw from, or success stories that we can draw from. I think a couple of Asian countries are having some interesting conversations going on. EPR as such is fairly at its nascent stages in terms of being used as an instrument for plastic pollution, to frame policies for plastic pollution. In Asia, what we're seeing is the Philippines actually very interestingly still thinking about what would EPR look like. A lot of civil society activists actually working with various government committees to strengthen the law. In Vietnam, what we're seeing is civil society actually working towards having more materials within plastic actually being classified as hard to recycle. So there is a category for recyclable and there's a hard to recycle category. When you put a material in the hard to recycle category, the process for EPR then works very clearly towards elimination rather than continuously focusing on recyclability. It is a very, it's an important recognition of the fact that there are very realistic technical barriers to recycling of some of the materials, and sachets is actually one of those, or multi-layered plastics. In US, actually, I don't think yet that they have one. Guidelines, I'm not sure if it's mandatory or not. In the UK, of course, they're voluntary still, and there's a lot of effort actually to be going on to move towards making this mandatory. I think those are the questions that I remember.
Yes. So, I mean, now I just want to also ask you, because in these rules, past-based rules, there are multiple authorities. So there are, I think, 3 or 4 authorities there. So one is, of course, pollution control codes for enforcement of the provision of rules, registration, and giving consents. There is secretary in charge of the urban development of the state, who is also authority for enforcement of the rules by the waste generators. And there are also local bodies like Gram Panchayat. They are also termed as authority under these rules for enforcement in rural areas. Now, it is also said in the rule that they can take assistance of the district magistrate to perform their functions. And above them, there are also like state level monitoring committees, central level monitoring committees. These things are there to oversee the work. Now, there are many authorities, and I think his intention is good. But do you think these authorities are functional as it was indicated, and whether there is a good coordination among themselves? So, yeah, that I wanted to know.
I would say this is almost a, I would say it's a little bit of a rhetorical question. I think you obviously preempt my answer that I think coordination has much to wish for. We have several challenges, I think, in coordinating between ministries. In fact, just those ministries that are directly responsible or should be liable for the plastic pollution we're seeing, we actually do not see coordination between them. So the Ministry for Environment and Forest with the Ministry for Chemicals and Fertilizers itself do not coordinate, right? So we're actually seeing the MOEF saying we need to do more to reduce plastic pollution. And we're seeing the Ministry for Chemicals and Fertilizers saying we need to increase plastic production, right? With actually no clear path about how plastic is actually going to get managed. And I think both of them have enough scientific evidence on the impacts, right? From the stage of extraction to production of plastic to use and post-consumer disposal. I think it's very clear. I think I mentioned a little bit early on in the presentation that even though many of our states actually have either partial or complete bans, I think implementation has been, of course, a challenge. So even when we've seen a state actually have a strong ban, the fact that neighboring states either don't have a ban or have partial bans means that plastic can continue to move, be manufactured in one state and be sold in another state, right? So I think those kind of gaps, hopefully, I mean, and I think this is the trade-off that we're constantly going to have to make in a federal structure, is how much do we want to centralize versus how much do we want to keep things at the state level. I think local bodies are caught between, a rock and a hard place, where we actually don't have as much devolution of authority, but we actually have a lot of delegation of the responsibilities. One aspect I think that this plays out in the current EPR is that CPCB has created a portal, right, to monitor producers, importers, and brand owners, so PBOs. All of them have to register on this portal. Only state officials and the CPCB officials, I think, will have access to this data. Now, if local bodies are going to be tasked with managing plastic waste and monitoring the implementation of the EPR framework, I would imagine that they should be having access, or they should have access to this kind of data, right? The other is that when we recognize that local bodies actually have lower capacity to deal with a lot of these things, putting a lot more of the data in the public domain, being a lot more transparent, having proactive disclosure, I think would be very important for researchers like Vidhi, actually, because they are able to complement what our local bodies need or state governments need by way of research, by way of data analysis, etc. Also, I think there's a requirement, I think, to file annual reports, minutes of meetings, those sort of things. What we're seeing is actually not many of these are actually available in the public domain. So I think there's quite a bit of challenge in, it's not just about coordination, but I think even institutionally, I don't think governments have either the wherewithal or the latitude to actually undertake the kind of tasks that they're tasked with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this resistance to share information is there across, like, I think, the pollution control boards. In case of water pollution, like, there's mandate to disclose the information, but they never make it public. Though the link is there, everything automated, everything is there, but no one wants to, so first is this, when you increase transparency, then people have more power, they can go to courts. Maybe that's the reason, we don't know. But there's no reason to keep it secret. It is a public interest matter, and they should make it public. Yeah, thank you for sharing this thing. And also, I also believe that, the Gram Panchayats and local bodies or SPCBs, they are also they don't have capacity, to do many more things. So there are already so many things they have to do. And over that, plastic is something I think that there should be some new administrative body to oversee all this thing, because this pollution control board and local bodies, they are clearly not working, at least in the Air Act, Water Act, and EP Act. So probably because of lack of capacity, lack of financial support from the government. So this is there. But tell me one thing, forget about this pollution control board and the thing which exists today. But if I ask you that, what should be the ideal regulatory framework, who should be the administrative bodies who should oversee the implementation of this plastic management rule, then who should be it? How will it look like, which can actually make things work? Do you have any idea, any solutions to on that?
I feel like this is kind of a trap, Devadita. Finding the ideal institutional framework.
It's very difficult to tell, but still, if you have any, if you thought about it.
Yeah, I think what I'm hopeful for is actually this globally binding legal treaty. Sorry, a global legally binding treaty. Only because I think the nature of plastic pollution is actually more complex than any of our institutions just within our own countries and jurisdictions can actually address, right? Plastic pollution actually is happening across our national boundaries, across these jurisdictions. Multinational corporations are functioning beyond our own boundaries, are not entirely liable in our own country, right? The sites of production of extraction of plastic, fossil fuel and the production of the plastic itself, most of it is happening outside of our boundaries. Yet a lot of the impacts are going to be felt here. So I think it's very important for us to actually recognize that this needs a global, treaty. And I think the other part of the global treaty is that a treaty that governs or regulates across the entire life cycle of plastic. That's the second, I think, aspect of having such a treaty. And I think there are certain global treaties that India has ratified, yet I think we are not complying with, right? So rather than, I think, creating an ideal new institution, I would say that we already have a lot of our policy framework in place. I feel like we really need to focus on better implementation and monitoring. And I think this definitely goes with hand in hand with transparency, proactive disclosure, sharing of information, sharing of roles and responsibilities a lot more. And I think coming back to, I think, obviously, the topic of this is also recognizing that corporates need to be held accountable for this, because they are making the choice of the material. They are making the choice of how they use it, in what kinds of products, in what kind of packaging, in what kinds of delivery mechanisms. And then to say that plastic pollution should be the responsibility of consumers is obviously, it doesn't correspond with the actual actions. So I don't have an ideal institution, but I would say an ideal framework is what I would think this should be.
So now I also mentioned that so law is one is this law and one is this authorities, but there are also like awareness and sensation people which plays active role, like in issues like plastic, which is very much behavioral kind of thing. So if you can create enough awareness, you can educate enough people, then I think this change can still be there. And when you talk about local bodies, so the plastic rules also mentions that it is the duty of these other local bodies that has create awareness. Of course, they should be supported by the government, like in enough terms of financial and everything. But they're also like there's some enabling provision which says that every vendor, street vendor and shopkeepers, they should know certain things like no carry bag will be made available free of cost. Intention was that people should use the poly bags. There are also things that they should not give items in the carry bag which doesn't have those labels or marks, which is the seven rules. It's very difficult for them to understand. And for me, unless I go to the rules, I won't be knowing what sign means what. Okay. So now there's in the rule like this, it especially mentioned that if they don't follow it, they have to pay such fines as specified under the bylaws of the local bodies. So first they have given the mandate of awareness, and they also given the power to penalize people. No, I have no information about how this penalization actually working, because I think this is an important thing. But also penalization without creating enough awareness is also wrong. I think this is should be done in a very soft way. So do you have any example, like by chance any example where actually any municipality or any local body has done some great work about educating people, and whether this penal provision has ever been used in any case?
I think the creating of the awareness really needs to go hand in hand with ensuring that there are alternative options that are accessible and affordable and convenient, right? Just creating the awareness of a problem doesn't automatically translate to the kind of behavior change that we need to see. And I think in this context, I think in some sense, our policies on plastic waste management are a little bit overdeveloped in comparison to the policy vacuum that we are actually seeing for alternatives. we actually do not have enough guidelines and enough standards on encouraging reusable solutions, right? Reusable solutions that mandate all food businesses to use reusable solutions, e-commerce sites or e-platforms where food and beverages can be ordered in. They're very simple tweaks that one can make, where one actually just removes cutlery from any food order, creating, and I mean, look at Bombay. We've had the Dabbawala system for decades, I think, if not centuries. And so those reusable solutions definitely exist. Not standardizing those are definitely a problem. And I think what we are seeing in a few other places is actually making those kind of tweaks. So for instance, in China, what some of those food platforms did was they allowed customers to actually function in a default situation where you have to opt in for cutlery rather than opting out, right? That actually changes your behavior. If you forget to order for cutlery, then you'll just figure out how else to get your cutlery. But rather than getting a ton of cutlery that you do not use, this is a very good way to actually minimize this. Similarly, restaurants in Taiwan, Hong Kong, all of them have actually made cutlery almost optional. And I think in Hong Kong, what we're actually seeing is very, very interesting, innovative third-party systems where somebody actually provides the reusable cutlery and containers to food businesses that cannot actually provide those utensils, right? So they will provide those to the businesses, to the food businesses. Those food businesses use that reusable container to deliver food to customers. There's a collect back system, there's a sanitizing, there's a hygiene process, and those things are then delivered back to the food, to those restaurants. A similar thing happening with beer bottles in the US. So there's a lot of innovation that happens when there is an enabling policy environment. So what we're seeing is it's very, very important for the policy to actually preempt how do we actually choose reuse, right? If we keep talking about plastic pollution and we keep doing these awareness campaigns, plastic is bad, but we actually do not create the standards that businesses then feel safe to opt for reuse, it is actually not an enabling environment. We are not actually moving towards elimination. So I think that one is, I think awareness building is almost moot. I feel like we should stop focusing on awareness building. I think we really need to focus on developing our sectors which use, which have reuse solutions that they can provide, setting up or enabling third-party reuse systems. And in very, very few cases where biodegradable solutions need to exist, I think we really need to think about what is the tie-up with, for instance, the forest protection laws or conservation laws or biodiversity policies that we have. How do we use forest dwellers? How do we encourage their livelihood options? We used to have so many leaf cups and plates and all of those things, kullards, clay pots, those sort of things already exist. So if we really need single use, I think we have biodegradable options which don't have the confusing labels. Now that's the other problem I think that you alluded to is how do we learn how to read those labels? What is a bioplastic? What is biodegradable plastic? What is compostable plastic? How do I know it's 75 micron or 120, right? I think this is foolishness in our policy to imagine that a layperson will have the understanding, will have the time to actually make an informed decision, right? And if this is our reality, I think the policy should actually reflect the reality rather than trying to change that. I think really functioning within this will likely lead us to better optimal conditions.
Yeah, I have explained it very well, and we are already reaching our time. So I have one last question from the audience. So Marisha, she works for Rainmatter Foundation, and she has this question with on her screen also. So are there any incentives for producers, importers, brand owners to embrace EPR? And what is the role that industry groups or bodies such as CII or the All India Plastic Manufacturers Association play in the EPR process?
So incentives for PBOs, I think at this point, it's more than incentives. I think it's just making it mandatory for them to comply. And I think at this point, I'm not sure if we should give them any other form of financial incentives like a tax break or things like that, because at the time of setting up, usually they do have a lot of subsidies to set up. What is the role that industry groups or bodies such as unfortunately, at this point, the industry bodies have not been playing a very positive or constructive role. They could actually be playing a much more informed role. I think one is definitely listening to some of the scientific evidence. A lot of these industry bodies are also liaising with civil society groups, a lot of NGOs. I think when they commission CSR projects, they really should be mindful of what kinds of projects they are commissioning on behalf of industries. And I think here, just to, I think, maybe leave you all with a thought, especially since we have lawyers in the room, is I think the gray zone within which a lot of our businesses are operating, where to a large degree, EPR is more or less voluntary and or whenever it's mandatory, it's very lax. Very poor monitoring systems are yet in place. However, we have CSR where this 2% profit has to be after tax profit or whatever needs to be spent on social welfare projects, right? What we're seeing a lot of companies do is preempt stricter mandatory requirements for EPR and now using CSR to actually invest into processes that help them later, right? And these still do not eliminate plastic. They just subvert existing policies. I know we don't have time to go into this, but I think it's definitely worth researching, how industry is playing off and industry bodies are actually playing off CSR versus EPR when it comes to plastic pollution.
Yeah, thanks, Satyarupa. It has been absolutely fantastic, like listening to your experience and sharing so many things, which is very useful for us also, like to understand the nuances of these rules. Because until we talk to a person who is actually working on this issue, it's very difficult for anyone to politicians to understand what is this. So yeah, with this, I just want to thank you for your time and making it possible, like to come on board and sharing your thoughts. And I must thank my members, Tarika, Himanshu, and our communist teams, Richa, Maitri, and Kalav, for arranging this talk. Also, special thanks to Rainmatter Foundation for supporting us with this initiative. And this talk will be available on our Vidhi's YouTube channel soon, within a week. And one can just go through our Twitter handle to keep a track of next talk. So with this, let's close this session. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Devatitya, and thanks everybody who joined. I hope this was exciting enough and interesting enough. If you all want to take forward this research, I hope you all do. Yeah.